The day Alma Maddox was told to choose between the Whitaker brothers was the same day she decided she would rather burn the whole arrangement to the ground than spend her life as a prize handed between men. It was the summer of 1878, deep in the basin country of southeastern Colorado, where the Purgatoire River cut through red clay land, and the cottonwood trees threw thin shadows that barely lasted until noon. The town of Cutter's Bend had been carved out of that rugged country only 6 years prior, built mostly by cattlemen who needed a place to water their herds and spend their earnings on whiskey and card games. By 1878, it had grown just enough to have a post office, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a saloon that never quite closed. The people who lived there were the kind of people who had chosen a hard life on purpose, or who had no other choice, and Alma Maddox was firmly in the second category. She had come to Cutter's Bend from Missouri when she was 22 years old, following her father, Thomas Maddox, who had convinced himself and his family that a cattle operation in Colorado would be the thing that finally turned their luck. Thomas was a decent man with a poor head for money, and a good heart that had gotten him into trouble more times than anyone could count. By the time Alma arrived with him, her mother 3 years in the ground from a fever that swept through their county, she had already learned that hope was a thing you held carefully, because it had a way of slipping through your hands just when you thought you had it secured. For 2 years, she had worked alongside her father on a modest 40 acres just east of town. They raised cattle and kept a kitchen garden and got by well enough. Alma could ride better than most men in the county and shoot straighter than all of them, which she knew because she had beaten every one of them at the county rifle contest and had the ribbon to prove it. She was not a woman who folded easily. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and a quality about her that made strangers think twice before they tried to underestimate her. The Whitaker family owned the largest spread in the basin. The Double W Ranch had been built by Ezekiel Whitaker, a hard-handed man from Tennessee who had come west after the war with nothing but a mule and a determination that bordered on ruthlessness. By the time Ezekiel died in the spring of 1877, the Double W encompassed over 3,000 acres of good grazing land, a main house with 4 proper rooms, a bunkhouse that slept 12 hands, and a reputation that stretched all the way to Denver. He left it to his 2 sons, because he had not been the kind of man to choose between them, and because he had secretly believed they would sort it out themselves. The elder son was Preston Whitaker, 26 years old, broad-shouldered, and handsome in a way that he was very aware of. Preston had taken after his father in almost every measurable way. He was loud in his opinions and confident in his judgment, and he moved through Cutter's Bend like a man who had already been told the world was his and had simply been waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. He was not cruel exactly, but he was careless in the way that men who have never faced real consequence often are. He laughed too easily and promised too much, and his word was the kind you wrote in pencil. The younger son was Milton Whitaker. He was 24. Lean and quieter in the manner of a man who had spent too many years being shouted over to bother competing with the volume around him. Milton had the same blue eyes as his brother but wore them differently, turned more inward, as though he was always watching something no one else had noticed yet. He had been the one who sat with their father at the end, when Preston was too busy managing the grief by staying away from it. He had been the one who learned the books and knew the names of all 12 hands and understood which sections of the east pasture flooded in spring. He did not talk about any of this. He simply did it, and when it was done, he went back to doing the next thing. Alma had known both brothers by sight for most of her 2 years in Cutter's Bend, the way you know the faces of people in a small town where everyone attends the same church and buys flour from the same store. She had spoken perhaps a dozen words to Preston, who had a habit of speaking at women rather than to them, and perhaps half that to Milton, who had helped her once when her wagon wheel cracked on the main road, saying almost nothing while he worked, but doing the job so thoroughly that she had not needed another repair on that wheel for the rest of the year. The trouble began in the early summer, when Thomas Maddox rode into a losing streak so deep it was almost architectural. It had started with a cattle illness that swept through their small herd and left them with barely a third of their original stock. Then a dry stretch that hammered the kitchen garden flat. Then a loan from the Cutter's Bend Bank that came due in a way Thomas had not quite anticipated, because he had signed the paper when the language was small and the hope was large. By June, the bank was talking about taking the land, and Thomas Maddox, in the desperate way of a man who has run out of practical options and moved on to social ones, went to see Ezekiel Whitaker's sons about whether they might buy the land at a fair price and allow him some time to find his footing elsewhere. What happened in that meeting was a thing that Thomas did not tell Alma directly, and she had to piece it together from the way he came home with a strange look on his face, half relieved and half ashamed. Preston Whitaker had made an offer, not for the land exactly. Preston had looked at Thomas Maddox and said plainly that he had been thinking it was time he settled down, and that he had always thought Alma was a fine-looking woman, and that if Thomas was agreeable, he could see his way to clearing the bank debt and giving Thomas a fair sum for a fresh start somewhere. And in return, Thomas could give his blessing for Preston to court Alma with serious intent. Thomas, being Thomas, had not said no. He had said he would talk to his daughter. He sat across from Alma at the kitchen table that evening, the lamp between them throwing yellow light over a conversation she would remember for the rest of her life. He explained it carefully, stumbling only slightly over the parts he was most ashamed of, and she listened without interrupting because she could see that interrupting would shatter him, and she was not ready to do that until she understood the full shape of the thing. When he finished, she sat quietly for a long moment. "He wants to buy me," she said. "He wants to court you," Thomas said, not meeting her eyes, "by paying off my father's debt." Which amounts to the same thing. Thomas did not answer, which was its own answer. She did not shout. She had learned long ago that shouting wasted energy she needed for better things. Instead, she stood and walked to the window and looked out at the dark land and the cold, bright stars above it, and she thought about what her mother would have said. Her mother had been the kind of woman who would have laughed first and then made a plan, and so Alma decided to do the same. "I will not be courted because a debt was cleared," she said finally. "That is not courting, that is purchasing. Alma, we are in a serious situation." "I know we are, Papa. I know exactly what kind of situation we are in. I have been managing our accounts since before you will admit it." She turned from the window. "I will find another way." "There is not another way." "Then I will make one." She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed and thought through every option she could see, and some she had to squint at sideways to make out their shape. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, she had a plan, and it was not a comfortable plan, but it was hers. She would go to the Double W herself. Not to talk to Preston, she would go to see about work. She knew cattle, she knew land. She could ride and mend fence and read a ledger, and do a dozen other things that a ranch the size of the Double W could use. If she could earn enough through the summer to clear the bank debt, the whole arrangement would dissolve on its own terms. She rode out early the next morning before the heat rose, the road to the Double W cutting west through pale grass and flowering sage. The ranch came into view gradually, the way large things do, beginning as a smudge on the horizon and growing into a collection of proper buildings. The main house long and white painted, the barn red, the bunkhouse set back into the north. It was a well-run place. Even from a distance, you could see it in the order of things. She had expected to be met by Preston, who would probably find this amusing and use it as an opportunity to press his advantage. Instead, she found Milton Whitaker sitting on the fence at the near end of the corral, reading what appeared to be a cattle ledger, his hat pushed back on his head in the way of someone who has forgotten they are wearing it. He looked up when he heard the horse, and there was a moment where she saw him recognize her and organize his expression into something neutral and polite. "Miss Maddox," he said, swinging down from the fence. He was wearing a plain work shirt faded at the elbows, and his boots were dusty in the way of a man who had already been working for several hours. "Looking for Preston." "I am looking for work," she said. That caught him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those blue eyes that were doing their characteristic inward thing, as though he was thinking 4 steps ahead of the conversation. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Cattle work, fence work, ledger work if you need it. I am good with accounts." She kept her voice even. "I know what this is about. I know my father went to see you in Preston. I am not here about that. I am here because I need to earn a wage, and I need to do it on my own terms." He was quiet again, not the uncomfortable quiet of a man searching for a response, but the considered quiet of someone who was actually thinking about what she had said. "We do not generally take on women as hands," he said. "I know you do not. I am telling you what I can do, and I am asking you to consider whether it is useful to you. If it is not, I will go find somewhere else." She looked at him levelly. "But I think you run this operation, and I think you know whether you need the help." Something shifted in his expression, so subtle it was almost not there at all. "Who told you I run the operation?" "Nobody had to. I have been watching this ranch from the road for 2 years. He looked away across the corral for a moment to where 2 of the hands were working a young horse in the dust. Then he looked back at her. "I could use someone who can read a ledger," he said, "and we are short 2 fence riders this month. Hennessy broke his hand last week and Carson went back to Texas." He paused. "It would not be the same wage as a man." She felt a flare of irritation but held it down. "How much less?" $30 a month, same as a first-year hand. I would give a second-year hand $35. She had expected less. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning if you are serious." "I am always serious, Mr. Whitaker." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "I noticed." She rode home with something that was not quite triumph but was close enough to count. She told her father that evening, and Thomas looked at her with an expression that had relief and worry braided through it in equal measure. "Preston is not going to like this," he said. "Preston's feelings about it are not my concern," she said. She was right that Preston would not like it. When she arrived at the Double W the next morning, and Preston came out of the main house and saw her talking to Milton near the barn, his face went through several distinct phases. First surprise, then calculation, then something that tried to be charming but landed closer to patronizing. "Miss Maddox," he said, coming toward her with the wide, easy smile that she suspected had worked on a great number of women. "I did not know we were expecting you." "Milton hired me on yesterday," she said. Preston turned to his brother. There was a conversation that happened between them without words, the kind that brothers who have known each other all their lives can manage. Milton met it steadily. "We needed fence riders," Milton said. "I could have managed the hiring," Preston said. "You were in Trinidad." The logic of this apparently held, because Preston did not argue further, though he spent the rest of that first morning finding reasons to be wherever Alma happened to be working. She was patient about this, because she had dealt with men like Preston before, and she knew that the best way to extinguish that kind of attention was not to respond to it at all, but to do the work so well and so completely that the other thing simply stopped having anywhere to attach itself. She was good at the work. She knew she was good at it, and within the first week the hands knew it too. She rode fence with a man named Durrell, a taciturn black cowboy who had been with the Double W for 3 years, and who assessed her on the first day with a long evaluating look, and on the second day began talking to her like a colleague, which was the highest form of respect available. She learned the east sections of the ranch fast, and by the second week, Milton put her on the ledger work in the evenings, which she did at the kitchen table of the main house while most of the house was quiet. It was during the ledger work that she first began to understand Milton Whitaker more fully. The books told his character the same way a man's handwriting does, in ways he might not realize he was communicating. The accounts were meticulous and honest. There were entries that marked losses clearly, without hedging language or creative arrangement. There were wages paid on time. There were small notations in the margins that she came to understand were his way of tracking things he intended to follow up on. A conversation with a supplier, a repair on the North Water trough, a note to himself that old Peters in the South bunkhouse had been coughing and might need to see the doctor in town. He was paying attention to everything, and he did it quietly, without announcement or expectation of credit. On the third evening she worked the ledger, he sat across from her with his own papers, working through correspondence that she gathered was about a land purchased to the north. They worked in silence for a while, comfortable in the way that silence can be between two people who do not feel the need to fill space with unnecessary sound. "You found the discrepancy in the feed account," he said without looking up. She had. There was a 3-month stretch where the hay purchases did not line up with the inventory numbers. It was not a large amount, but it was consistent, which made it intentional. "I wrote a note beside it," she said. "I did not know if you wanted me to address it or just mark it." "Who do you think it was?" she considered. "The numbers are from before Hennessy's accident. Could be him. Could be whoever was taking the hay deliveries." "It was Hennessy," Milton said. "I knew it a month ago. I have been waiting for a way to address it that does not leave us short-handed at the same time." She looked up at him. "That is a careful way to handle it. Firing men in anger makes enemies," he said. "Letting a thing resolve itself naturally is better when you can afford it." She thought about that for a moment. Your father was not like that. Something crossed his face that she could not quite name. "No," he said, "he was not." She went back to the ledger. A minute passed. "Why did you really come here?" he asked, not accusatory, genuinely wanting to understand. "I told you I needed work." "You could have found work in town. Mrs. Harwell at the general store has been wanting help for months. Easier work than this." She set down her pencil. "Because if I work in town, I earn a town wage and it will take me until winter to clear the bank debt. Here I earn fence rider wages plus what I get for the ledger work, and I can do it by September." She held his gaze. "And because I wanted it to be clear that I came here on my own terms and not on Preston's." There was a pause, and she saw him weigh something. "I should tell you that Preston has spoken to me about you," he said. "Since you started here, he asked me to tell you that his offer to your father still stands." "And what did you tell him?" "That it was not my business to deliver messages for him." He looked down at his papers again. "I thought you should know it was said." She felt something settle in her chest, some small but significant thing. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." They worked in silence for another hour, and when she rode home that night the dark land felt different around her, less heavy than it had been. Preston's courtship, such as it was, intensified over the following weeks in the way of a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants by escalating until resistance wears down. He would appear at her elbow during the noon meal with an extra helping of something, looking pleased with himself. He made a point of riding out to wherever she was working in the afternoons, ostensibly to check on ranch progress, though the checking always ended up being about her. He was not unkind in these moments. He was almost charming. But she could feel the architecture of the thing beneath the charm, the assumption that she would eventually come around, the patient certainty of a man who believes the question is not whether but when. She remained consistent, polite, clear, and completely unaffected. It was during the 4th week of this that the more serious conversation happened. She was in the barn working with a mare that had gone lame on a back heel, cleaning the hoof carefully, when Preston came in and stood in the doorway and said, without preamble, "I need to know if you're going to give me a fair chance, Alma." She did not look up from the hoof. "My name is Miss Maddox. We have been in the same county for 2 years. That does not change my name." She set the hoof down gently and moved to the next one. "What do you mean by a fair chance?" "I mean that you come here every day and you work and you talk to everyone on this ranch, including my brother, but you have barely said a dozen words to me since you arrived. That is not a chance." She straightened and faced him. He was genuinely good-looking. She acknowledged that without it meaning anything to her. He had an open face and easy confidence, and in another set of circumstances she might have understood the appeal. "I am a hired hand on this ranch," she said. "I am here to work. I came here to earn a wage, not to be courted. If you want to change that arrangement by making it awkward for me to do the job I was hired to do, then I will have to find work elsewhere. But I am not going to give you a fair chance, as you call it, because a chance implies that I am open to the possibility, and I am not." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why not?" "Because the way this started was wrong," she said. "And you know it was wrong. You offered my father money for access to me. That is not something I can get past, and I would not want to even if I could." He opened his mouth, and she saw the defense forming, the justification that it was just a practical arrangement and not meant to offend. She held up a hand. "I'm not trying to wound you. I'm being honest because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve management." She picked up the hoof pick again. "I'm going to finish this mare's feet now." He left without another word, and she heard his boots on the packed earth of the barn floor retreating, and she breathed out slowly and went back to the work. She did not see the exchange between the brothers that afternoon, but she heard about it from Durrell, who had a gift for being near things without appearing to be. "Your boss Preston had some words with his brother this evening," Durrell said the next morning, the two of them riding the east fence line in the low morning light, the horses moving at an easy walk through the sage. "About what?" "About you. Seemed like Preston told Milton to stop keeping you on here. Said having you around was making things complicated." Alma kept her eyes on the fence. A post was leaning 3 degrees out of true, and she made a note of it. "What did Milton say?" "Said the fence riding and the ledger work were his to manage, and that if Preston had a personal matter to sort out he should sort it out personally, not by meddling with the ranch operations." Durrell paused. "Said it pretty quiet, but Preston came out of that conversation looking like he'd walked into something he hadn't expected." She thought about that for the rest of the morning, turning it in her mind the way you turn a stone to see all its surfaces. The days fell into a rhythm that she found she looked forward to more than she had expected. The mornings were fence work and cattle checking, and the physical language of ranch labor, which she had always found satisfying in the way that concrete things can be when you are by nature someone who likes to see the results of effort laid out in front of you. The evenings were the ledger and the quiet company of Milton Whitaker across a table, which was a different kind of satisfaction, subtler but no less real. She began to notice things about him the way you notice things about a place you have decided to stay in, cataloging the particulars. He took his coffee without sugar, though she noticed once that he had sugar in it when he thought no one was looking, and she thought this was something to do with not wanting to seem soft in front of the hands. He always took the last meal at the table, and always made sure there was enough left for anyone who had not eaten yet. He had a habit, when he was thinking hard about something, of running his thumb along the edge of whatever he was holding, a cup or a pencil or the brim of his hat. He read, which surprised her the first time she noticed the books on the shelf in his room, because she had not expected it but immediately felt that she should have. There was an evening in early July when a summer storm came in fast off the mountains to the west, the sky going the color of an old bruise in the span of half an hour. She was still working at the kitchen table when the rain hit and the wind came with it, the kind that made doors work against their hinges. Milton came in from checking the barn, his shirt dark with rain across the shoulders, and sat down across from her and picked up his papers without comment. The lamp between them threw its circle of light in the noise of the storm, and she was struck suddenly by the intimacy of the scene, the smallness of the lit space inside all that weather, the two of them in it together. "You did not have to stay for the storm," he said. "The road gets bad fast in weather like this," she said. "I thought I would wait it out." He nodded, looking at his papers. "You can take the spare room, save the ride." She looked up at him. He was entirely matter-of-fact about this, not suggestive, just practical in the way of someone who lives on a ranch where weather is a real and logistical thing. "That is all right," she said. "I do not want to cause any more talk than I already have." He looked up then. "Talk has already been caused," he said. "It is mostly about you being better at fence riding than Hennessy ever was, but there is some of the other kind, None of it matters. It matters to me, she said. My reputation is one of the few things I have right now that is entirely my own. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw him think about this with the particular attentiveness he gave to things that deserved it. Then I will have one of the men drive you into town when the rain lets up a little, he said, and I will tell anyone who asks that you stayed because the road was dangerous and left as soon as it was not. She felt something warm move through her. Thank you, she said. It is the truth, he said, looking back at his papers. Easy to defend. The rain let up after 2 hours, and she rode home in the wet dark with Durrell, who had been designated her escort, and she sat in the saddle looking up at the sky where the storm had left a clean emptiness, and she thought about Milton Whitaker in a way she had not permitted herself to think before, honestly and without immediate dismissal. She was not naive about the complications. He was the younger son of a family that had tried to arrange her in relation to his brother. The land she worked was his land. Her father's debt was still tied to the Whitaker family's orbit, even if Preston's direct offer had been declined. There were 100 ways this could become something she could not manage cleanly. But the way he had said it was the truth, easy to defend, with no ceremony and no performance, just the calm of a man for whom honesty was simply the practical choice, that stayed with her all the way home. Preston came to see her father in the second week of July. Alma was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she went to the door and saw him swinging down at the fence post, his good hat on and his boots freshly blacked. She felt the familiar tension of it but kept her expression neutral. He greeted Thomas Maddox with warmth and sat at their table and had coffee and talked about the summer season and the cattle prices and the general state of the basin. And Thomas, who genuinely liked Preston the way he genuinely liked most people, talked back with equal warmth. Then Preston turned to Alma with a direct and disarming look that she had to give him credit for. I owe you an apology, he said, for how this whole thing began. I went about it badly and I want to say that plainly. She set down her coffee cup. All right. I am not here to press anything on you. I just wanted to say that I spoke the wrong way and I know it. He turned his hat in his hands. I would like to call on you proper if you would allow it, just as a caller. No conditions attached. She looked at him for a long moment. He seemed genuine. She had learned enough about people to know that genuine did not always mean it would hold, but she could see that he was trying in this moment to be better than he had been at the start. I am not going to encourage anything that is not there, she said carefully. But I will not be rude to a man who has apologized well. He nodded, and the relief on his face was real. That is all I am asking. He came 2 more times over the following 2 weeks, bringing small proper gifts, a jar of preserved peaches from the ranch kitchen, a new pair of work gloves in her size that he had guessed correctly, which she noted cost him some observation to get right. He was attempting to court her on genuine terms, and she could see the effort in it. She appreciated the effort, and she could find no actual fault with him in these visits. He was good company. He told stories well and laughed at the right moments and was kind to Thomas, which meant something. But every evening she rode back to the Double W and sat across from Milton at the kitchen table, and the quality of that quiet was different from anything Preston offered. Preston gave her his best face in those visits, the performance of a man trying to win something. Milton gave her nothing but his actual self, undressed of performance entirely, working beside her with the same distracted concentration he brought to everything, occasionally saying something precise and unexpected that she found herself turning over for hours afterward. It was in the 3rd week of July that it happened, the thing that clarified what had been slowly taking shape. She had finished the ledger early and was putting the books away when she knocked the day's tally sheet off the edge of the desk, and it fell behind the bookcase. She knelt to reach it and could not get her arm far enough in, and after a moment she heard him cross the room to help. He moved the bookcase easily, the muscles in his forearms tightening with the weight, and retrieved the sheet and handed it to her. And when she took it, Their hands were close enough that the warmth of his was a thing she felt before she stepped back. She looked up at him. He was looking at her in a way that he had not looked at her before, or perhaps that she had not allowed herself to notice before. Not the calculating assessment of someone who wants a thing, but something quieter and more permanent, the look of someone who has been paying attention for a long time and has finally admitted to himself what he has been paying attention for. "Milton," she said, and did not follow it with anything else, because there was nothing else yet. He stepped back and set the bookcase down and did not say anything either. But the silence between them was a different kind of silence from then on, something that had been named without words, which made it real in a way it had not been before. She rode home slowly that night, the stars above the basin enormous and uncomplicated, and she let herself sit in the feeling without analyzing it to death for once in her life. What she felt for Milton Whitaker had been building since the first morning she had ridden onto that ranch, quiet and constant the way a river is constant, not dramatic but permanent. It was not the performed brightness that Preston offered. It was something else entirely, something that felt like being known. The problem was that the situation had not changed. She was still employed by the Whitaker brothers. Her father's debt was still real. Preston was still calling on her twice a week with preserved peaches and clean boots, and Milton had said nothing, done nothing, asked for nothing, which was, she realized slowly, entirely consistent with who he was. The crisis came at the end of July in a way she had not anticipated. Thomas Maddox, doing what Thomas did when anxiety pressed him into corners, had gone to see the bank about renegotiating the loan terms, and had come home with the information that the bank had sold the debt to a man named Cogsworth, who was a land speculator out of Pueblo with no patience for gradual repayment and no interest in Thomas's explanations. Cogsworth wanted the money or the land by the 1st of September, which was barely 5 weeks away. Alma had been planning on September for her own timeline, but she had been planning on 6 more weeks of wages, and Cogsworth's deadline was immediate. She told no one about the new timeline. She sat with it alone for 3 days, running the numbers every way she could, and every way she ran them came up short. She was 3 weeks of wages away from the full amount, 3 weeks she did not have. On the 4th day, she rode to town and went to see Cogsworth at the hotel where he had taken a room. He was a stout man with the eyes of someone who found other people's difficulty mildly entertaining, and he listened to her with the faint smile of a man who has heard every version of this conversation and has already decided its outcome. She offered what she had, all of it, the summer's wages minus the small amount she had kept back for food and necessities, and she asked for the 3 additional weeks. Cogsworth said no. She rode back to the Double W in the afternoon heat with a headache behind her eyes and the specific anger that comes from having done everything right and still arriving at the wrong destination. She was not going to cry. She was done with crying for things she could not immediately fix, but she sat on her horse at the gate of the Double W and looked at the ranch in the slanted afternoon light, and thought that in 5 weeks this world she had made for herself over the last 2 months would be dissolved, and her father would lose the land, and she would have to start over somewhere, and find a way to do it without letting the injustice of it make her smaller. Milton came out of the barn and saw her at the gate. He walked toward her in the unhurried way he moved everywhere, and she got down off her horse and told him everything, because there was no point in not, and because he was the one person here whose response she trusted. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How much short are you?" She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment. "I will advance you the wages," he said, "against future work. You can work it off through September." She shook her head. "That is charity, and I will not take it. It is a wage advance against contracted labor. There is nothing charitable about it. You are being generous, and we both know it." "I am being practical," he said. "I need a fence rider and a ledger keeper, and I have one that I do not want to lose. Paying an advance on a reliable worker is good business." He met her eyes steadily. "Do not make it into something it does not have to be." She wanted to argue further. She also knew that he was right, and that refusing the offer out of pride when her father's land was at stake was a luxury she could not actually afford. "All right," she said quietly. "I accept." They shook on it. His hand was warm and sure around hers, and he held it a beat longer than a business handshake required, and she felt the full weight of everything that had been growing between them sit in that extra beat. She paid Cogsworth the following morning. The man took the money with his faint smile and left Cutter's Bend on the noon stage, and Thomas Maddox's land was safe, and that chapter of the crisis was done. Preston heard about the wage advance within the week, because small towns are small. He came to find Alma on a Tuesday morning while she was working the water trough repair on the north end of the property, and his face had a different quality to it than usual, less easy, more honest. "He paid your debt," Preston said. "He advanced wages," she said, not looking up from the trough repair. "That is a fine line. It is the correct line." Preston sat on the fence nearby and was quiet for a moment, which was not his natural mode. She glanced up at him and saw that he was working through something. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "that I have been going about this entirely backwards, and maybe that I have been wanting the wrong thing for the wrong reasons." He looked at her with a directness she had not seen from him before, stripped of the easy charm. "I wanted you because you were the best-looking woman in this county and because I thought having you would mean something about me. That is a sorry reason." She set down the wrench and faced him. "Yes, it is," she said, but not unkindly. "I think you should talk to my brother," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you saying this?" "Because he has been watching you since the day you rode onto this ranch, and I have never seen him look at anyone that way. And because I know what my brother is and what I am, and you are more like him than you are like me." He rubbed the back of his neck. "And because the last time I said something to him about you, I told him to stop keeping you on, and he stood his ground for you, and I have been thinking about that ever since." She looked at Preston Whitaker and saw, perhaps for the first time, the better version of him that existed underneath the careless confidence, the man he might grow into if circumstances required it. "You are a better man than you started out being in this story," she said. He actually laughed at that, a genuine one. "I am trying." She finished the trough repair and went back to work, and the conversation settled in her like something important that had been needed. That evening at the kitchen table, the ledger was balanced and the correspondence was answered and the lamp was burning low between them, and Milton was making his quiet notes in the margins and she was watching him do it and not pretending she was not. "I am going to say something," she said. He looked up. "I have been working here for 2 months, and in that time you have been fair and honest, and you have helped me without making me feel like your help cost me something. And I have been paying attention to who you are, and I think you are the best kind of man I have ever encountered." She kept her voice steady, though her heart was doing something irregular. "And I think you know that I feel more for you than an employee ought to feel for her employer, and I think you feel something too, and I would like to know if I am wrong." The silence after that was the longest of her life. Milton set down his pencil. He looked at her with all the careful attention he gave to everything, and there was nothing guarded in it now, nothing held back. "You are not wrong," he said. She let out a breath she had been holding since July. "I did not say anything," he said, "because you came here with your own reasons and your own plan, and I did not want to put anything on top of that. You had enough on top of you." He paused. "And because Preston was already making his case and I was not going to compete with my own brother." "I did not want you to compete," she said. "I wanted you to just be yourself, which is what you did." He looked at her across the table with the lamp between them. "What would you like to do about it?" he asked. "I would like you to take me to supper in town on Saturday," she said, "properly, as a caller." Something happened to his face in that moment that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not a smile exactly, though a smile was part of it, more the opening of something that had been keeping itself careful for a long time. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she agreed. They went back to the papers, but the silence between them was luminous. The supper at Cutter's Bend's one proper restaurant, a small establishment run by a woman named Flora Keene who cooked exceptionally well and minded her own business, was simple and comfortable in the way of two people who already knew each other well and were now simply allowing themselves to exist in a different register. Milton had cleaned up with evident care, his good shirt buttoned to the collar, his hair less habitually disheveled than usual, and he sat across from her in the small dining room and talked with her in a way that was different from their evenings at the table only in that it was purely for the pleasure of it, unattached to any work. She learned things about him that the ledger had not told her. He had wanted, as a young man, to study agriculture at a proper college in the East, but his father had called that soft and unnecessary, and he had stayed. He had a quiet but real sense of humor that revealed itself in the kind of dry observation you had to be paying attention to catch. He had been to Santa Fe twice, and had found it extraordinary and had not told anyone because he felt they would not understand what he found extraordinary about it. He believed, with a conviction that surprised her by its passion, that the land of the basin could sustain people for generations if they managed it carefully and did not take from it faster than it could recover. "That is not a popular opinion among cattlemen," she said. "Most popular opinions among cattlemen are wrong," he said. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, and she saw it land on him like warmth. She talked, too, more than she usually did, because he had the quality of making you feel that what you said would be received with genuine attention. She told him about her mother, about Missouri, about the rifle contest, and the year she had spent keeping their books in the black through 3 separate disasters that would have broken a less stubborn operation. She told him about the night she had lain awake and decided she would come to the double W on her own terms, and he listened to all of it with the focused quality he brought to everything important. "You were going to find a way regardless," he said. "I just made the road a little shorter." "You made it possible," she said. "That is not nothing." He looked at her across the table in the candlelight of Flora Keene's restaurant. "No," he said, "I suppose it is not nothing." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, a deliberate thing, unhurried, and felt his hand turn under hers to hold it. Outside, Cutter's Bend went about its Saturday evening business. Horses at the rail and voices from the saloon, and the general yellow spill of lamplight from every window. And inside the small restaurant the world was very much the size of the table between them. They walked back to where the horses were hitched after supper, and he helped her mount and then stood by her horse for a moment with his hand on the horse's neck, looking up at her. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly." "You took me to supper," she said. "You are already calling on me." "I mean with intent," he said, and she heard the weight of the word and matched it. "Then call on me with intent," she said. He nodded, the way he nodded when something was decided, once and complete. She rode home under the same enormous stars, and felt the fear and the determination that had carried her through the summer beginning to transform into something that felt, cautiously and carefully, like happiness. The calling went on through August, and it was the kind of courtship that suited them both, unhurried and honest and increasingly certain. He came to the Maddox place on Sunday afternoons and sat with Thomas, who liked him with a sincere warmth that Alma suspected was partly relief at the direction things had taken, and talked about cattle and land and the state of the basin. He would walk with Alma in the evening, when the heat had gone out of the day and the land smelled of sage and cooling dust, and they would talk about everything and sometimes about nothing at all, and the nothing at all was as valuable as the everything. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday evening in late August, standing near the fence at the edge of the Maddox property, with the sky going from orange to violet above the western hills. It was a careful kiss, the kind that asks a question, and she answered it by staying in it longer than a question required, which made it a different kind of thing. When she stepped back, she could see by the quality of his expression that the world had rearranged itself slightly for him too. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "You said it exactly when I needed you to," she replied. Preston, to his genuine credit, was gracious about the whole business. He had stopped calling on Alma after the conversation at the water trough, and by August, he had begun calling on a woman named Louise Harker, who had come to Cutter's Bend from Kansas to work as the new schoolteacher, and who had the sharpness of mind and firmness of opinion that Alma had always suspected Preston would do better with than with someone who simply admired him. He seemed happier for it, lighter in the way of a man who has stopped performing and started actually living. He came to find Milton one afternoon in the barn while Alma happened to be nearby working with the mare, and she heard the conversation without intending to. "Are you going to ask her?" Preston said. "That is my business," Milton said. "I know it is your business. I am asking anyway." A pause. "Yes," Milton said. "Good," Preston said, and there was something uncomplicated and brotherly in the single word, and Alma set down her work carefully and smiled at the horse in front of her. He asked her on the 1st of September. He had asked Thomas first, with a formality that was real rather than performative, because he understood that Thomas Maddox was the kind of man for whom that mattered. Thomas had given his blessing with a warmth that had apparently made both men look away from each other for a moment to collect themselves. He asked her in the kitchen of the Double W, where they had spent so many evenings across the table from each other, because he said afterward that it seemed right to ask her in the place where he had first understood the size of what he felt. There was no kneeling involved. He simply stood across from her with the lamp between them, and said that he had been certain since sometime in June, and he was asking because he wanted a life with her if she would have him, not because of the land or the ranch or any practical consideration, but because she was the most honest and capable and remarkable person he had met in his 24 years, and because an evening without her in it had stopped feeling like a complete evening. She said yes before he had finished the sentence. He laughed, surprised by her speed, and she said she had been waiting since June too, and she was not going to make him wait any longer for an answer. He came around the table, and she went to meet him, and he held her with the same thoroughness he brought to everything that mattered, and she put her face against his shoulder, and felt something in her chest that she could only describe as the resolution of a long tension she had not realized she was carrying. They were married in October of 1878 in the church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, with Thomas Maddox looking so pleased he seemed to be glowing with it, and Preston standing as Milton's best man with Louise Harker on his arm, and Durrell in his best coat, and Flora Keene in the third pew, and most of Cutter's Bend filling the rest, because a Whitaker wedding was an event. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Alcott, who was a practical man and kept it to the necessary words, and when he got to the part where Milton was told to kiss his bride, Milton did not waste any time on ceremony, and Alma did not help him slow down, and there was some laughter from the pews that was the real and affectionate kind. They had the wedding supper at the Double W, the long tables set up in the front yard under the evening sky, with lanterns hung from the cottonwoods that Ezekiel Whitaker had planted when the house was built, and which had grown to something fine. Durrell played the guitar, which nobody had known he could do until that night, and the music was good enough that the dancing started early and ran late. She danced with her father first, and Thomas held her tight and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "Your mother would have loved him," and she felt the tears try to come and let them for just a moment before she brought herself back. She danced with Preston, who was a very good dancer and who held her at a perfectly correct distance and said, "You were always right to say no to me. I want you to know I know that." "I do know that," she said, "and I think you are going to be all right, Preston." "Louise thinks so too," he said with the particular smile of a man who has recently discovered what it is like to be seen properly by someone. She danced most of the evening with Milton, who was not a polished dancer but who paid attention, which made up for everything, and who held her in the uncomplicated way of a man who is simply glad to have his arms around his wife. Late in the evening, When the music had gone quiet and the guests were drifting toward their horses, and the lanterns were burning low in the cottonwoods, they stood together at the edge of the yard where the light gave way to the dark land and looked up at the sky, which was enormous and clear the way it always was at that elevation, the stars scattered in their unself-conscious extravagance. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking that I rode to this ranch in June to save my father's land and do something on my own terms," she said, "and I did both of those things." "You did," he said, "and then I got more than I planned for." He put his arm around her. "I'm hoping to continue to be more than you planned for," he said, and she felt the warmth of his voice through the whole of her. "I suspect you will," she said. The first year of their marriage was not easy, because the first year of anything real rarely is. They were learning each other in the close quarters of shared life, the daily business of who made the coffee and who managed what argument and where the friction was and how to navigate it. There was friction. She was opinionated and he was stubborn, and when those two things met over the question of the East pasture management, or the wages for the hands, or the best way to handle a supplier who had been under-delivering, they had to work out a language for it that was honest but not damaging. They were good at the honesty. It was the thing they had in common most deeply, the commitment to saying the true thing even when the diplomatic thing would have been easier. Their arguments were clear and complete and resolved, without the long-held silences and accumulated resentments that could rot a marriage from the inside out. She took on the full bookkeeping for the W, which she had been doing in practice since the summer, and which became official in January of 1879. Milton gave her full authority over the accounts, which was not a common thing for a man to do, and which she understood as the statement of trust it was. She brought the books into a clarity they had not had under the previous arrangement, found two more discrepancies that they resolved quietly, and identified a way to restructure the feed contracts that saved the ranch enough money by spring that Milton put the difference back into wages for the hands, which she noted made all 12 of them work slightly harder, because people work better when they are treated well. Thomas Maddox found his footing too. With the land secure and his daughter settled, he turned his attention to improving what he had rather than being consumed by anxiety about losing it. Alma and Milton helped him negotiate a partnership with a smaller rancher to the south, which gave Thomas both company and practical support, and by the following spring, he was talking about expanding the herd in a way that was grounded in actual possibility rather than hope alone. Preston married Louise Harker in the spring of 1879, a smaller ceremony than his brother's because Louise was not interested in spectacle, which was one of the things Preston had come to love about her. She brought a rigorous intelligence to his life that seemed to suit him in ways that surprised even him. Alma and Louise became genuine friends over that year, the kind that two strong women become when they recognize in each other a common fluency, a directness, an unwillingness to perform the roles they were supposed to perform. The W thrived under Milton and Alma's joint management. They hired 2 additional hands by summer of 1879, including a young man named Garrett who had come up from New Mexico with good recommendations and the kind of steady temperament that made him a natural fit for the operation. Preston managed the cattle side with a growing seriousness that Alma thought was partly Louise's influence and partly something that had been in him all along, waiting for a reason to come forward. In November of 1879, Alma found out she was going to have a child. She told Milton on a Tuesday evening, which was just an ordinary evening with no particular ceremony around it, and he put down whatever he was holding and looked at her with a quality of feeling on his face that she would catalog among the best moments of her life. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was Milton. "I am very well," she said. He came around the table and held her and said nothing for a long moment, and she felt the warmth of his happiness against her, and was glad she had told him on an ordinary day, because ordinary days were where their life really lived. Their son was born in July of 1880. They named him Thomas after her father, which made Thomas Maddox compose himself carefully and then fail at it entirely and weep in the way of a man who does not weep often. The baby had Alma's dark eyes and Milton's way of paying attention to everything, arriving in the world with the focused expression of someone who had a great deal to observe and intended to get started immediately. Milton held his son with the careful precision of a man who has decided that this is the most important thing he will ever do correctly. And the image of him standing by the window in the morning light with the baby against his chest was one that Alma stored in the deep part of her memory where the irreplaceable things lived. Thomas Maddox came to see the baby and held him with the practiced ease of a man who had held a baby before, his daughter once years ago, and said to the small face looking up at him, "You have landed in good hands, young man, better than most." The ranch grew. The years unfolded in the way of years when things are fundamentally right, not without difficulty, not without the losses that the land and the time inevitably brought. A hard winter in 1881, a dispute with a neighbor over water rights that required legal intervention, the death of old Peters in the South bunkhouse who had been with the W since Ezekiel's time and whose absence made a recognizable hole in the fabric of the place. But beneath and through all of it, the structure of what she and Milton had built together held firm. Their second child was born in the spring of 1882, a girl they named Eleanor after Alma's mother. She arrived with a full complement of opinions from the beginning and a laugh that could fill a room. And Durrell, who had become something like a permanent fixture in the family by this point, declared her the finest development on the W in recent memory, which was high praise from a man who said exactly what he meant. Milton and Alma were in the habit of taking a walk in the evenings when the work was done and the children were settled, a practice they had started during their courting and had not stopped. The basin was beautiful in the evening, the light going warm and horizontal across the grass and the sage, the mountains to the west keeping their steady purple presence, and they would walk and talk or walk without talking, and it was in those hours that she felt the full weight of what her life had become. She had arrived in Colorado territory at 22 years old with a father who needed saving, and a determination that was the only thing standing between her and a future she had not chosen. She had refused what was offered and gone looking for what she could make herself. She had sat at that table every evening across from a man who was watching her with careful blue eyes and not saying a word, not asking anything, not pressing or performing, just being present and true and steady. And she had chosen him. Not because she was told to, not because a debt was owed or a bargain was struck, but because in a summer full of pressure and complication and the constant weight of necessity, he had been the only one who asked nothing of her at all, and who had given everything anyway. She had been told to choose between two brothers. The older one had offered money and ease and a future wrapped in someone else's terms. The younger one had offered only himself, not even that, had not offered, had only been present and honest, and had let her arrive at her own conclusions without putting a thumb on the scale. She had chosen the one who had not asked. On an evening in the autumn of 1882, when young Thomas was 2 years old and Eleanor was just finding her legs, Alma stood at the fence at the west end of the W property and watched the sun go down over the mountains, painting the sky in the extravagant colors of that high country, orange and rose, and a deep clear violet, and she thought about the girl she had been in June of 1878, lying awake in a narrow bed making plans. Milton came to stand beside her. He had Eleanor on his hip, and the baby was watching the sunset with the intense interest she brought to everything. Thomas was somewhere behind them with Durrell, who was teaching him the names of things, the way he had once taught Alma the east fence line. Milton put his free arm around her and she leaned into him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "June," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he always was when he was actually listening. "June of what year?" "78, she said. "The morning I rode up to the ranch and found you reading a ledger on the corral fence. "I remember," he said. "You rode up like you owned the whole valley." "I was terrified," she said. He turned to look at her, the baby between them reaching up to touch his face with small, curious fingers. "You did not look terrified." "I know," she said. "That is the trick." He held her closer. Below them the land moved in the evening wind, the grass going silver in the last light, and the mountains stood patient and enormous against the sky. It was the same land it had always been, hard and beautiful and indifferent, but what had been built on it and within it was entirely human and chosen, and that made it something else entirely. "I am glad you rode up," he said. "I am glad you did not ask me to," she said. He pressed a kiss to her temple, easy and warm, and Alina grabbed a fistful of Alma's hair and laughed at the achievement. And from somewhere behind them came Thomas's voice demanding to know where the moon went during the daytime, which was a question Durrell was taking extremely seriously. The sky deepened into full night while they stood there, and the stars came out one by one in the way they always did over the basin, first the brightest and then all the rest, until the whole enormous sky was full of them, and the land below was dark and sweet-smelling and known, and everything was exactly as it should be. The years ahead of them would bring more of what years bring, more children perhaps, more difficulty and more pleasure, more evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the ledger spread open, and the quiet that was the real language of their life together. The ranch would grow, and the children would grow, and the town of Cutter's Bend would grow, and the basin country would be what it had always been, a hard and luminous place that gave back exactly what you put into it, nothing more and nothing less. Thomas Maddox would live to see his grandchildren walk, and he would sit on the porch of the W on Sunday afternoons and declare himself the most fortunate man in Colorado territory, and no one who knew the full arc of his story would argue with him about it. Preston and Louise would build their own life on the eastern side of the W, a partnership of two people who had each needed the exact specific quality the other carried, and Louise would become the longest-serving teacher Cutter's Bend ever had, and their 3 children would be raised with the double inheritance of Preston's warmth and Louise's clarity, which turned out to be an excellent combination. Durrell would stay with the W until it was a different kind of place than it had started out being, managed by people who understood that the land was shared, and the work was shared, and the acknowledgement of that was the only honest way forward. He would watch young Thomas learn to ride and young Alina refuse to be told there was anything she could not do on a horse, and he would think that the world was making some slow and necessary progress. But on this particular autumn evening in 1882, all of that was still ahead, still unwritten, still in the process of becoming. What existed right now was the fence and the sky and the two of them standing in the last of the light with a baby between them and a boy asking questions behind them, and the land that had tested them and yielded to them and held them through everything. Milton Whitaker had never asked Alma Maddox for anything. He had only shown up every day and been exactly who he was, honest and steady and paying attention, and she had seen it and come toward it on her own terms in her own time, without anyone directing her steps. She had been told to choose between 2 brothers. She had chosen the one who had not asked. And in choosing him she had chosen herself, the version of herself that did not bend to arrangement or collapse under pressure, or accept a future measured out in someone else's hands. She had chosen freely, fully, with all the stubborn, deliberate certainty that had gotten her through every hard thing before him. Standing at the fence in the fading light of a Colorado autumn, Milton's arm around her and their daughter reaching for the first stars, she thought that this was what it felt like to have arrived, not at an ending, but at the beginning of something that would hold for the whole of her life. She had been afraid of so many things in the summer of 1878. She had been afraid of the debt, and the land and the narrow corridors of circumstance that kept closing in around her and her father. She had been afraid that the only choices available to her were the ones other people had arranged. But she had ridden up to a corral fence one morning and found a man reading a ledger with his hat pushed back on his head, and he had looked at her with those careful blue eyes and asked what she needed, and she had told him the truth, and he had listened to all of it, and everything that followed had been the consequence of that simple exchange. Two people being honest with each other at the right moment in the right place. The moon was rising over the eastern hills now, full and white, and Alina pointed at it with a serious expression as though making an official observation. Alma looked up at it and then at her daughter and then at her husband, and she felt the whole of it settle into her, permanent and certain, the way things do when they are true. "Come inside," Milton said. "Supper will be getting cold." "You always know when to say the practical thing," she said. "Someone has to," he said. She took Alina from him and tucked the baby against her hip, and they walked back across the yard toward the house where the light was spilling warm from the windows. And Thomas was already through the door ahead of them with whatever he had learned today carried importantly in both small hands. And inside the kitchen there was warmth and the smell of food and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of home. The door closed behind them. The night settled over the double W, over the cottonwoods and the corral, and the long stretching fence lines running east and west. The land was dark and still, and the stars moved above it with the slow patience of things that have been doing this for longer than anyone can measure. Somewhere in the far pasture, cattle moved through the silver grass. The Purgatoire River ran on in the dark, the same as it had always run, wearing its slow path through the red clay land. And inside the house, there was a family that had been made of honesty and stubbornness and patience, and the particular kind of love that does not announce itself but simply shows up every day and does the work. That, too, was a kind of permanence. That, too, would hold.